It is 4:47 in the morning. The Mojave Desert is still dark. Not the soft dark of a city neighborhood, where streetlights bleed orange through curtains and car engines idle somewhere down the block. This is the absolute dark of open land, the kind that swallows sound, the kind that makes a man feel the particular smallness of being alone. The temperature is 41 degrees Fahrenheit. By noon it will be 103. And in the middle of all of that darkness, on a stretch of scrubland 6 miles east of Kanab, Utah, a single lantern is burning. The man holding it is John Wayne. He is wearing no costume, no cavalry jacket, no frontier duster, no weathered badge. He is in canvas work trousers and a plain flannel shirt, both of which he put on himself at 4:15 without assistance. He is 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighs 228 pounds, and in the lantern light, his shadow stretches 40 feet behind him across the pale desert floor. He is completely alone. The nearest crew member, a grip named Chester Albright who has worked with Wayne on 4 consecutive pictures, is asleep in a bunk trailer 200 yards to the west. The director, a man who has been directing westerns for 19 years and who believes he knows everything about his lead actor, is in a rented cabin another half-mile beyond that. Neither of them knows what Wayne is doing out here. Neither of them has ever known. Because for the better part of 3 decades, from roughly 1942 until the early 1970s, John Wayne did this every single morning before a camera rolled. Every location, every season, every picture. And for just as long, the people around him chose not to ask why. This is that story. To understand what John Wayne was doing in the dark on that Utah scrubland in the autumn of 1950, you have to understand what his mornings were supposed to look like, and why the version that existed on paper was never the version he lived. The shoot was the Fighting Kentuckian. No, correct that. By autumn 1950, Republic Pictures had already moved him to the next picture. This was pre-production for Rio Grande, the 3rd installment of director John Ford's Cavalry trilogy, scheduled to begin principal photography on location the following Monday. The call sheet for that Monday listed Wayne's first appearance on set at 6:30 a.m. Hair and makeup would begin at 5:45. Wardrobe at 5:20. Ford's standing rule was that his lead actor would be camera ready, horse ready, and mentally present. Ford's exact phrase, mentally present, no later than 6 minutes before the first shot. John Ford was not a gentle man about these expectations. He had directed 78 films by 1950. He had won 3 Academy Awards for directing, a record that would not be broken for decades. He ran his sets with a precision that bordered on military, which was appropriate because Ford had served during World War II, and the organizational rigor he'd brought back from the Pacific had permanently altered the architecture of how he worked. He once reduced a studio executive to tears in front of 60 crew members for arriving 11 minutes late to a production meeting. He did not apologize. He simply turned back to his storyboards and continued speaking. Wayne had been in Ford's orbit since 1928. That is 22 years. In that time, he had absorbed the man's rhythms, his silences, his sudden bursts of controlled rage, and the equally sudden and inexplicable moments of warmth that followed them. He knew that Ford's demand for mental presence was not metaphor. Ford meant it literally. He meant that when the camera turned, the man in front of it had better not be carrying the weight of a bad night's sleep, a contract dispute, or a half-finished conversation with his wife. He meant that whatever the actor needed to do to arrive clean and clear at that moment, Ford didn't care what it was, as long as it worked. For John Wayne, what worked had never appeared in any contract writer, any production memo, or any interview transcript. It was not yoga. It was not prayer, at least not in any organized sense. It was not the elaborate vocal warm-ups that his contemporaries like Henry Fonda practiced, or the character study journaling that the newer generation of actors arriving from the actor's studio was beginning to bring to Hollywood in the early 50s. What Wayne did was simpler than any of those things. And in its simplicity, it was more demanding. Every morning, no matter the location, whether Moab or Monument Valley, the backlit at Republic or a rented ranch in Durango, Mexico, Wayne rose between 4 o'clock and 4:30 a.m. He dressed without assistance. He took no coffee. He walked. Not to anywhere specific. Not along a planned route. He walked into whatever landscape surrounded him, desert, scrubland, coastal bluff, dry riverbed. And he walked in silence until the sky began to change. Not until it was light, but until it was changing. There is a distinction. The moment of full sunrise, when the disk clears the horizon and shadows snap into place, that moment was never his target. It was the 20 minutes before that. The gradient. The in-between. He did this alone. Always alone. And the crew, those who noticed, had an unspoken agreement that stretched across productions, across studios, across years of working beside the man. You didn't follow. You didn't ask. You simply noted the empty bunk or the absent truck, and you said nothing. And when Wayne appeared at the wardrobe trailer at 5:20, boots already dusted with the morning's earth, you pretended not to notice where he'd been. Chester Albright, the grip who would eventually become one of the few crew members to speak about this openly, and only after Wayne's death in 1979, said it simply. He came back different every time. Not better, not calmer, not more focused in any way you could put your finger on. Just different. Like he'd settled something out there that none of us were invited to know about. But here's where it changes. Because on this particular morning in October 1950, Chester Albright did not stay asleep. He woke at 4:55 with a cracked water line in the equipment trailer and stepped outside in the dark to deal with it. And he saw the lantern. And for the first and only time in 4 years of working alongside John Wayne, he watched. Chester Albright was 34 years old in 1950. He'd grown up in Bakersfield, California, the son of a citrus farmer, and had come to Hollywood in 1939 as a day laborer on the backlots, carrying cable and stacking equipment flats for wages that barely covered his rooming house on Cahuenga Boulevard. By 1946, he had worked his way to key grip on several A pictures, and he was good at the job in the way that men who have never done anything else become good at things, with a physical intelligence that bypasses thought and lives in the hands. He was not a man given to sentimentality. He didn't collect autographs. He didn't ask actors for photographs or extended conversations. In his understanding, actors were a particular kind of professional whose job happened in front of a camera and his job happened behind one. And the gap between those two positions was not unfriendliness, just category. You respected the category, which is why what he described years later in a taped conversation with film historian Scott Amon in 1984 carries a particular weight. Because Albright was not trying to mythologize. He was describing something he had genuinely not known how to categorize for 34 years. He said, "I stood there in the dark about 80 feet away and I watched him. He didn't know I was there. And the first thing I noticed was how still he was. Because when you work around a man that big, that tall, with that kind of bulk, you get used to the space he takes up. He doesn't shuffle or fidget the way smaller men sometimes do. But this was something else. This was a stillness I'd never seen in him on a set. He was holding the lantern down low, maybe 12 inches off the ground, and he was looking east. Just looking. And his left hand, his free hand, was open, palm facing down toward the ground. Not pressed against his leg. Just open. Like he was holding something invisible. Like he was feeling for something in the air. Albright stood watching for nearly 11 minutes. He timed it against his wristwatch because he was aware, even in the moment, that this was not the kind of thing he would fully trust his memory with. In those 11 minutes, Wayne did not speak. He did not sit. He moved twice, once to take 4 steps to his right, adjusting his position relative to some fixed point only he could identify, and once to lift the lantern slightly and hold it at chest height for approximately 90 seconds before lowering it again. Then Albright saw it. The physical detail that he would spend 34 years trying to articulate correctly. Wayne's shoulders, those wide, unmistakable shoulders that the costume department spent real effort accommodating, that had been measured at 52 inches across in his Republic Pictures records. Those shoulders dropped. Not slumped. Not collapsed. Dropped, the way a man's shoulders drop when he has been bracing for something and has finally decided he does not need to brace anymore. And then he turned east fully, and he waited for the sky to start changing. What nobody had told Wayne to do was stop. Nobody on any of his sets had issued a directive about stillness. Nobody had coached him on breathing or on the specific value of pre-dawn desert silence. What Albright understood, watching from 80 feet away in the dark, was that John Wayne had built this practice entirely on his own. That it had emerged not from instruction, but from necessity. That a man carrying 228 pounds and 3 decades of expectation in a business that had very specific ideas about what he had found, somewhere in his early career, that the only reliable way to get free of all of it, even temporarily, was to walk into the dark and wait for the sky to remind him that it did not know his name. But here's what Albright could not yet see. what only the full picture of the morning would reveal. The challenge, if you could call it that, had arrived not from a person but from a moment in time. And the moment was this. 1950 was, by most measures of the Hollywood machinery, the most demanding year of John Wayne's professional life. He had completed Sands of Iwo Jima the previous year, and the picture had generated an Academy Award nomination for Best Actor. His first, after 22 years in the industry. He was 43 years old. He had made 81 films. And the nomination had arrived not as a celebration, but as a kind of trap, because what the industry was now saying, between the lines of its congratulations, was this: "We have been watching you for 22 years, and now we are going to evaluate you properly." The casual permission of the B-Western era, when expectations were low and physical presence was enough, had quietly expired. Something new was being asked of him, and nobody had said it directly. Nobody on any of his sets, nobody at Republic or at RKO, had sat him down and said, "The rules have changed, and here is what we now need from you." It had simply arrived wordlessly, in the way expectations in Hollywood always arrived. Through the temperature of a room, through the specific quality of silence after a take, through the language of what was not said. John Ford had felt it too, and Ford, characteristically, had addressed it in the only way Ford ever addressed anything, which was obliquely, furiously, and in the form of a demand rather than a conversation. 3 weeks before the Rio Grande shoot, Ford had called Wayne to his office on the Argos Pictures lot and had told him, in front of 2 producers and an uncredited script doctor, that this picture required more from him than cavalry posture and a steady horse. Ford's exact reported words, as reconstructed from a production diary kept by assistant director Wingate Smith, were, "Duke, you've been playing John Wayne long enough. Now I need you to play a man." It was said with Ford's particular combination of love and contempt, the kind that only men who have known each other for 22 years deploy against each other. Wayne had not responded in the room. He had nodded once and left. But inside, according to his own private journals, published posthumously in 1982, the words had landed with the specific weight of something he had already been saying to himself. He wrote on the date of that meeting, "He's right. I've been writing the character. Time to find out if there's a man inside it." That is not a small question for any person to be asking themselves. That is a question with significant implications for identity, for consistency, for everything a career of 22 years had been built on. And John Wayne was asking it alone, in the way private men ask the questions that matter. Not aloud, not in therapy, not in any conversation that could be quoted or reported, but in the pre-dawn dark of a desert morning, standing in the silence with a lantern held 12 inches above the ground. This was the confrontation, not with another man, with the gap between who the world believed he was and who he needed to become. 47 witnesses, 47 crew members by the production's own records, would work alongside John Wayne during the Rio Grande shoot. Of those 47, at least 11 would later make some reference, in interviews, memoirs, or recorded conversations, to Wayne's pre-dawn absences. None of them at the time knew the full shape of what was happening. One of them tried to understand it directly. Harry Carey Jr., Dobe to everyone on the set, was 27 years old in 1950, in his first significant role in a Ford film, and he possessed, by his own account, the kind of blunt curiosity that young men carry before the world teaches them that some questions should remain unasked. He had noticed Wayne's morning absences on the second day of shooting. By the 4th day, he had walked up to Wayne at the lunch break and said, "Duke, where do you go in the mornings?" Wayne had looked at him for a long moment, not with irritation, with something more like appraisal. Then he said, "Where I need to go," and he turned back to his plate. A producer sitting 2 seats away, a man named Steve Ames, who had been attempting to lighten the exchange with a mild joke, saw Wayne's expression and stopped speaking mid-sentence. He later told Carey that it wasn't hostility that silenced him. It was the recognition that the question had been answered as completely as it was going to be, and that pressing further would be a misreading of the room. Nobody pressed further. Not on that shoot. Not on the next one. Not for 30 years. Here is what John Wayne was actually doing. Chester Albright watched for 11 minutes. But Wayne had been out there for 41 minutes before Albright arrived. And in those 41 minutes, in the pattern that Albright would reconstruct from a single partial observation and Wayne's own later writing, the practice unfolded with a specificity that was anything but casual. In the first minutes, roughly the first 8 to 12, varying by location and weather, Wayne walked. Not to exhaust himself, not to reach anywhere. He walked at a pace Albright described as deliberate but not slow, approximately 80 to 90 steps per minute, which is the lower boundary of what physical therapists would later categorize as a purposeful walking gait. He did not use a fixed route. He used the landscape itself as the structure, moving around obstacles rather than over them, following the natural drainage lines and rock formations of whatever terrain surrounded him. This was not accidental. Wayne had grown up working on ranches in the summers of his youth in Glendale and Lancaster, California, and he understood that land has its own logic, that following it rather than imposing on it was not weakness but efficiency. By the time he stopped walking, by the time his shoulders made that particular drop that Albright would spend 34 years remembering, he had covered between a quarter mile and a half mile of ground. He had said nothing. He had thought, by his own account in his journals, as little as possible. He had specifically not rehearsed lines. He had specifically not thought about the day's scene structure, the blocking, the technical requirements of the upcoming shot. He wrote, "The whole point is to arrive at stillness. Not to think your way there. To walk there." In the second phase, the stationary phase, which Albright caught the tail end of, Wayne stood. He chose a direction east, always east, because east was where the light was going to come from, and he wanted to be oriented toward it when it arrived. His posture, Albright noted, was not military attention and not casual slouch. It was the posture of a man who has agreed to carry his own weight without complaint. Spine aligned, feet roughly shoulder width, weight distributed equally. The kind of posture that costs nothing to maintain and communicates everything about whether a man trusts himself. The lantern was held low. This was deliberate. Wayne wrote about it once, in a private letter to his friend Ward Bond. When you hold a light too high, it makes you the center. I don't want to be the center at 4 a.m. I want to be a person who is watching something happen that has nothing to do with me. The something that was happening was the sky. What John Wayne was watching, every morning, was the specific quality of change that precedes the sun. Astronomers call the 20-minute window before civil sunrise nautical twilight, the period when the horizon becomes distinguishable but the sun has not yet cleared it. In the desert, in clear weather, this period produces a quality of light that is genuinely difficult to describe to anyone who has not stood in it. The sky moves through a progression of blues that begins at near black and passes through cobalt, ultramarine, and finally a pale gray lavender that lasts approximately 4 minutes before the first orange edges appear. It is not dramatic. It is not the spectacular horizontal bands of color that photographers pursue. It is quieter than that. Slower. A change so gradual that the eye cannot catch it in motion. You simply notice, after several minutes, that the sky is different from what it was. Wayne was watching something that could not be hurried. This is not a small thing for a man in his position. John Wayne's professional life in 1950 was organized entirely around deadlines, around the management of time, around the strict accountability of production schedules that cost money per hour. Every call sheet he had ever received in 22 years told him precisely where to be and when. Every director he had ever worked under had an opinion about the tempo of his delivery, the timing of his movement, the precise interval between action and rest. The film industry's relationship to time was one of control. Total, documented, enforced control. If you were 6 minutes late, Ford knew. If a take ran long, the assistant director's pencil was already moving. And every morning, John Wayne walked into the only situation he could find that did not operate on those terms. The sky did not give him the sunrise. Faster because he was John Wayne. The nautical twilight did not compress itself because a production was beginning in 90 minutes. The desert was not on anyone's call sheet. It simply was, in its own time frame, completely indifferent to his stature, his contract, his box office position, or Ford's opinion of his performance. And in that indifference, something specific happened to him. He described it in his journals on the morning of October 14th, 1950, 4 days into the Rio Grande shoot, in language that is not the language of a man performing insight for a reader, but of a man recording a functional observation about his own machinery. The thing about standing still out here is it separates what matters from what feels like it matters. By the time I get back to the trailer, I know the difference again. On the set, I sometimes lose that. Out here, I can't. In the third phase, the final 3 to 5 minutes before Wayne turned back toward the trailers, he simply watched the horizon become visible. Not the sun. The horizon, the line where land and sky became distinct from each other. Because that, he had decided somewhere in the years of doing this, was the moment that mattered. Not the arrival of light, but the arrival of definition. The moment when everything that had been blurred together in the dark became itself again. He turned back to camp before the sun crested. Always. He did not stay for the spectacle. Chester Albright, watching from 80 feet away on that October morning, saw Wayne turn at the exact moment when the horizon became visible. He saw him lift the lantern to chest height, the gesture he'd made once before, the one Albright had not understood. He understood it now. It was not a signal, not a ritual. Wayne was simply extinguishing the lantern. He didn't need it anymore. The dark was over. And then he walked back toward the trailers. Not quickly, not slowly, at the same deliberate pace he'd used going out. 80 feet away, Albright stood completely still. He had the particular sensation, he would say in 1984, of having witnessed something private that was also, somehow, completely without shame. Like watching a man pray who does not know the words but means every one of them. He stepped back inside the equipment trailer and said nothing. Harry Carey Jr. was 73 years old when he published his memoir Company of Heroes in 1994, and in the chapter on Rio Grande, he gave the question he had asked John Wayne at the lunch table. "Duke, where do you go in the mornings?" More space than almost any other single moment. In the book. Not because Wayne's answer had satisfied him at the time, because it had taken him 44 years to understand it. He wrote that Wayne's response, "Where I need to go," had seemed in the moment like a deflection. Like the mild irritation of a private man being asked about a private thing by someone too young to know better. And Carey, being 27 and curious, and in possession of the particular confidence of a man recently praised by John Ford, had catalogued it that way and moved on. But 44 years in the industry will alter a man's catalog. Carey wrote, "I have spent 40 years now watching actors prepare. I have watched every method, every exercise, every elaborate technique that the schools and teachers and theorists have produced. And what I understand now, at the end of all of it, is that preparation is only ever one thing. It is the practice of becoming available. To the character, to the other actors, to the scene. Everything else, the sense memory, the emotional recall, the physical warm-up, it's all just different shapes of the same essential act. You are making yourself available." And what John Wayne was doing at 4:30 in the morning in the desert was the most complete version of that practice I ever witnessed. He wasn't preparing a performance. He was clearing himself, making room, so that when the camera turned, there was space in him for something real to happen. This was the transformation John Ford had demanded and not explained. The gap between playing John Wayne and playing a man was not a gap in technique. It was a gap in availability. And Wayne had known it intuitively for years before Ford named it, had been addressing it alone in the dark, before any director with any number of Academy Awards to his name had found the right words. The one direct conversation, the only conversation on record in which Wayne addressed the practice with something close to full disclosure, happened not during Rio Grande but 11 years later, on the set of The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance in 1962. His conversation partner was Jimmy Stewart. Stewart, at 54, was as precise and methodical an actor as Hollywood had ever produced. He prepared differently from Wayne, more consciously, more architecturally, with a specificity about motivation and emotional logic that reflected his background in theater and his years of deliberate craft building. He was not disparaging of other methods, but he was curious about them, with the genuine intellectual curiosity of a man who has made his craft the central project of his life. Late on a Tuesday evening, after a long day of shooting in the physical heat of the Stage 11 soundstage, Stewart found himself alone with Wayne in the small room behind the set that the production had designated as a rest area. It was approximately 7:15 p.m. Most of the crew had left or were packing equipment. Stewart had a cold glass of water. Wayne had nothing. Stewart asked, directly and without preamble, in the manner of a man who has decided the moment is right, "What do you do in the mornings, Duke?" Before call. Wayne was quiet for a moment. Not evasively. He was, Stewart later told his biographer Michael Munn, visibly deciding how to answer honestly. Then he said, "I go out and I wait for the light to know where it's coming from. And while I'm waiting, I stop being an actor." Stewart turned the glass in his hands. Wayne continued, "Everybody on this lot knows what they expect from me before I say a word. That's 25 years of pictures. That's real. I'm not arguing with it. But if I walk onto a set carrying all of that, carrying what they expect, there's no room for the character. So every morning I go out, and I put it down somewhere. And then I come back, Stewart said after a long pause. And it works. Not a question. An acknowledgement. Wayne picked up his hat from the chair beside him, looked at it for a moment, and said, "It's kept me honest." He stood, put the hat on, and walked back to the set to confirm a blocking detail with the director. Stewart sat there for another 4 minutes. He did not move to his own preparation notes. He simply sat. He would later say that what Wayne had articulated in those 2 exchanges, "Stop being an actor, and it's kept me honest," was the most efficient description of authentic performance he had ever heard in 30 years of professional conversation. Not a method, a position, a daily choice. The next morning, Jimmy Stewart set his alarm for 4:45 a.m. He walked out of the hotel and stood in the dark of the Paramount backlit parking lot for 20 minutes, watching the section of sky he could see between the soundstage roof lines. He felt, he said, approximately 1/10 of whatever Wayne had been feeling. But it was enough to understand that the 10th was real years later. Specifically in the spring of 1982, 3 years after Wayne's death from stomach cancer at the age of 72, Jimmy Stewart gave a lecture at the American Film Institute in Los Angeles. The audience included 340 students, faculty, and working professionals. The lecture was on the subject of sustained performance practice, how an actor maintains authentic access to their instrument across a long career. Stewart spoke for 41 minutes. He discussed vocal technique, physical preparation, the management of emotional recall in aging actors whose bodies no longer recover from physical demands as efficiently. He discussed the particular challenge of working in a medium that plays the same performance indefinitely, and the psychological pressure of watching your younger self on a screen while standing in your older body. And then, in the last 11 minutes of the lecture, he spoke about John Wayne. He did not tell the story of the conversation on stage 11. Not entirely. It was still too private for that, or he believed it was. But he described the practice. He described what it meant to walk into the pre-dawn dark and wait for the sky to produce its light on its own schedule, and what that act of patient surrender to a timeline that had nothing to do with your career did for a man's ability to arrive empty-handed on a set. Arrive without defenses. Arrive without the accumulated sediment of expectation and reputation that even the most gifted actors collect across a long life in the industry. He said, "The man had a discipline that most of us never develop because we never feel the need." He felt the need very early, and he built the answer himself, without instruction, without theory. He just knew that the distance between him and the work had to be cleared every morning, or it would grow until he couldn't cross it anymore. So he cleared it. Every morning. In the dark. Alone. The AFI students who were in that room went on to careers that would produce more than 200 films and television productions over the following 4 decades. Several of them, among them 3 who would become directors of significant commercial and critical reputation, have cited Stewart's 1982 lecture as the moment they began understanding performance, not as technique, but as practice. Not as a collection of methods, but as a daily act of maintenance. A daily act of clearing. Chester Albright retired from the film industry in 1974. He lived in Bakersfield until his death in 1991. In the taped conversation with Scott Amon in 1984, he was asked whether he ever regretted not asking Wayne directly about the morning walks. He thought about it for several seconds. Then he said no, because I don't think he would have told me anything different from what I already saw. I was there. I saw it. Whatever he was doing, it was real and it worked. You could see it in him all day after. That's enough. Now return to where we began. 4:47 in the morning. Mojave Scrubland. A lantern held 12 inches above the ground. A man standing in the dark, waiting for a sky that will change on its own schedule, at its own pace, in a universe entirely unconcerned with who he is or what he has built. The question is not what he was doing out there. The question, the one that sits quietly underneath everything else about this story, is what it means that he did it alone. That in 22 years of films, in 47 productions on desert locations, across 3 decades of working alongside Ford and Hawks and Hathaway, and every major director of the studio era, he never explained it, never taught it, never made it into a method with a name. He built it in private, and he kept it in private, and he used it every morning until his body would not let him walk anymore. One man, one practice, one daily act of honesty that history almost missed entirely. He didn't do it to be remembered. He did it to be real. He didn't build it to last. He built it to work. And every morning before the camera rolled, it did. But there is one morning in John Wayne's life, one specific sunrise at one specific location, on a picture he never spoke about publicly, where that practice was tested in a way that left a mark. A mark not on the landscape, not on any production record, but on Wayne himself. Something shifted in him that morning. And the people who knew him before it and after it always said the same thing. He came back from that shoot different. Not better. Not calmer. Just different. And the reason why, that's a story for another time.